Imagine running a stress test on an entire nation. What actually happens to the mechanics of a modern economy if you subtract half of its total workforce for exactly 24 hours? On October 24, 1975, a small island nation ran this exact experiment in real life. In a coordinated effort, 90% of Iceland's female population executed a simultaneous labor strike, an event they called Women's Day Off. The strike functioned as a controlled failure of a national engine, intended to reveal exactly how much the country's stability relied on their labor. At the time, women filled the base of the workforce, even as the system minimized their financial worth through significantly lower pay and limited opportunities. But the public sector was only half the picture. There was a second economy, the uncompensated domestic labor required to keep households running and the next generation cared for. The protesters faced a structural problem. Negotiating for recognition is difficult when the ethnolic system refuses to track domestic labor as actual work. To prove the existence of this foundation, they had to remove it, allowing the national infrastructure to stall under its own weight. On the morning of the strike, 9 out of 10 Icelandic women stayed away from their official workplaces. The first domino fell immediately. Without female tellers, the banking sector could not open. Next, the supply chains failed. Stripped of their female laborers, factory assembly lines stopped. Supermarkets and retail shops followed, shuttering their doors as their workforce vanished. In a single morning, the absence of female workers paralyzed the visible Icelandic economy. The strike included a second equally disruptive front, a total refusal to cook, clean, or provide childcare at home. This created an immediate vacuum, leaving the men of Iceland solely responsible for their household survival. Husbands attempted to manage their children while also dealing with the breakdown of the commercial services they usually relied on. Because many of these men had never been taught to cook or manage a household, basic daily functions like preparing meals became another point of failure. The public sector strike forced the government to respond, but the domestic strike meant men had no fallback for basic daily needs. Those 24 hours demonstrated that without women, the country's basic functions ceased to exist. It was no longer possible to ignore how much of the nation's stability relied on their labor. This realization led to decades of legislative changes as the government began codifying gender equality into national law. We can see the long-term impact of those changes in modern data, specifically the rankings compiled by the World Economic Forum. On the forum's Global Gender Gap Index, Iceland is currently the #1 country in the world for gender equality, outperforming the global average by a significant margin. The women of Iceland proved that equality wasn't something to be requested from the system. It was won by showing the system that it could not function without them.